Okay, so you've heard of the 5th Beatle, but what about the 6th, 7th, 8th, or 9th? Here's some of the other musicians who helped the Fab Four make history. Though they would come to be known as the Fab Four, the Beatles were originally a 5-piece act. The band's bassist during their early years was a young man named Stuart Sutcliffe, a Scottish-born artist and musician who was raised in Liverpool and met John Lennon there. In 1960, Lennon and his bandmates convinced him to spend his earnings on a Hofner bass and join the band. Despite lacking natural playing ability, Sutcliffe was actually a talented artist. He toured with the Beatles constantly and developed a rock star look that helped win over the audiences at their performances. His relationships with the other Beatles were sometimes strained. They tended to be jealous of his looks and success with women. Sutcliffe left the band in 1961, apparently to pursue his career as a painter. Only a year later, however, he suffered a fatal brain hemorrhage in Hamburg. He was just 21 years old. His death was heartbreaking for the Beatles, particularly Lennon, and he was later memorialized on the cover of their album Sgt. Pepper's Lonely Hearts Club Band. Before Ringo Starr became the world's quintessential rock drummer, there was Pete Best. Another Liverpool musician, Best performed with the Beatles during the early live shows in Germany and the UK. He was still their drummer after they signed their first recording contract and can be heard on an early recording of the band's debut single Love Me Do. We're just gonna pump the brakes real quick. You die-hard Beatle fans probably know this, but just to lay it out, Best drummed on the first recording of Love Me Do in June 1962. Then Ringo played drums on the second studio session in September of 1962, but the actual released version featured Andy White, a session drummer. It's a lot to say that Andy White doesn't count in our Beatles members listing, but yes, we're aware of him. Back to the main story, and you know this part. Best was forced out of the band in August 1962.
What does that do to a person? What is there resentment there? Is it?
As with Stuart Sutcliffe, there's some talk that the other Beatles may have been jealous of Best's dashing good looks, though this wasn't the real reason he was replaced. EMI producer Ron Richards and producer George Martin both thought that Best's drumming wasn't precise enough for a band planning on recording hit singles. They believed Starr to be a major improvement in that regard. Best was later able to capitalize on his former membership of the band, however, releasing an album playfully titled Best of the Beatles in 1965. Billy Preston's experience with the Beatles began before they had found fame, and culminated in one of the band's most famous moments. He first encountered the band in 1962 in Hamburg when he was on tour with the rock and roll legend Little Richard, himself a major influence on the Beatles. Years later, when the now famous Fab Four found themselves in something of an artistic dead end, they encountered Preston again. With tensions in the band running high, they turned to the keyboardist to join them in their recording sessions. Preston's presence created a new dynamic in the studio, lightening the mood and helping the musicians focus on the songs instead of personal strife between the band members.
You're in the groove.
John Lennon was reportedly keen for Preston to become a full-fledged Beatle, but McCartney vetoed the idea. Nevertheless, he came as close to joining the band as any musician had since their early days. The single Get Back was released as being performed by the Beatles with Billy Preston, and he was at the keys when the Beatles played their final public performance together on the roof of the Apple Corps offices on January 30th, 1969. He also continued to perform with members of the Beatles during their solo careers. He later contributed to the music of major acts such as Johnny Cash, Ray Charles, and Red Hot Chili Peppers. Jimmie Nicol played with the Beatles at the height of Beatlemania and found himself in the full glare of the media spotlight. Nicol was a respected session drummer who had caught the attention of Beatles producer George Martin after playing sessions for an act called Tommy Quickly. In June 1964, the Beatles were on the eve of a major world tour when Ringo Starr was hospitalized with tonsillitis and pharyngitis and left unable to perform. The cost of canceling the tour was too great, and despite Starr's misgivings, the band decided to hire a stand-in. Martin suggested Nicol. The drummer had previously played on an album of Beatles cover versions, so he had no trouble learning the songs from the tour. He slipped into the band seamlessly. Martin himself said, "He did the job excellently and faded into obscurity immediately afterwards." Manager Brian Epstein provided Nicol with his pay for 10 shows and a TV appearance and gave him a watch with an inscription from himself and the band. Nicol later recalled, "The boys were very kind, but I felt like an intruder. They accepted me, but you can't just go into a group like that. They have their own atmosphere, their own sense of humor. It's a little clique, and outsiders just can't break in." Nicol continued in the music industry for a while, but later went bankrupt. He worked a variety of different jobs before retreating from the public eye entirely. If you're waiting for us to list off a bunch of Quarrymen members, we're going to stop you right there. Yes, in a basic sense, the band before the Beatles was the Quarrymen, but most of the guys you think of as being members of the Quarrymen and therefore also Beatles were long out of the group by the time the Quarrymen dissolved in 1960, so we're only counting one Quarryman on our list. Chas Newby was a friend of Pete Best, who had previously played with John Lennon in his former band, the Quarrymen. After the Beatles returned from their stint in Hamburg in 1960, the group was looking for a stand-in bassist who could fill in and allow them to continue gigging in the UK. Newby fit the bill and played with them for a number of shows. Lennon was reportedly keen to keep Newby on as the Beatles' permanent bassist, but the truth was he never considered music a career. He was more interested in returning to college. After his stint with the band, Newby turned to teaching mathematics, though he returned to perform in a reformed version of the Quarrymen in 2016. So if you're following along, Newby wasn't an original member of the Quarrymen, but joined a modern version decades later. As for his almost brush with fame and fortune, he once told the Sunday Mercury, "People sometimes don't believe me when I say I have no regrets, but I really haven't. I have enjoyed my life immensely." Newby died on May 22, 2023 at the age of 81.